Papa. Joanne's voice cracks, but not from pain. From something Marco hasn't heard in 18 months. Joy. Papa, we're standing. Joyce grips her twin sister's hand, their small fingers intertwined, tears cutting rivers down her 6-year-old cheeks. Behind them, Catherine, the maid they hired out of desperation 3 months ago, the woman his mother called a charlatan, the stranger who appeared at their gates with no references and impossible promises, stands with her hands folded. As if miracles were simply inevitable. Impossible, Marco whispers, his native Portuguese surfacing in shock. The doctors, every specialist said, never. But denial shatters against reality. His baby girls are standing. Actually standing, their legs bearing weight that medical science swore they'd never support again. After 18 months of the world's finest neurologists, experimental treatments that cost more than most people earn in a lifetime, and prayers whispered in the dark hours when even a mafia boss admits his powerlessness, the answer came from the last person anyone expected. A woman who walked through his gates carrying nothing but a worn duffel bag and a secret that could destroy them all. 1 month ago, Marco Vitali's world existed in shades of violence and ash. The attack that shattered Joanne and Joyce's spines happened on a Tuesday afternoon, their 4th birthday party, pink balloons bobbing in the breeze, their laughter bright as summer. Marco was across Chicago, finalizing a weapons deal that would expand his territory into the South Side. He remembers checking his watch, 3:47 p.m. Thinking he'd make it home in time for cake. His phone rang at 3:52 p.m. The Castellano family sent their message in bullets and blood. 6 armed men crashed the party while Marco's daughters played pin-the-tail on the donkey. They weren't there to kill children, just to send a reminder that the Vitali Empire had enemies with long memories and longer reach. But 4-year-olds don't understand turf wars. When the shooting started, Joanne and Joyce ran toward their bedroom. 3 bullets meant for Marco's lieutenants went wide. 2 tore through Joanne's lower spine. 1 severed Joyce's spinal cord between L3 and L4. By the time Marco arrived, paramedics were loading his daughters into ambulances. Both girls unconscious. Both bleeding from wounds that would steal their childhood in ways more permanent than death. The neurological damage, doctors explained with clinical detachment, was catastrophic. Permanent. The girls would never walk again. Marco's response painted 3 city blocks crimson. Within 1 week, the Castellano family ceased to exist except as cautionary tales whispered in Chicago's underworld. He burned their operations to ash, killed every soldier who'd participated in the attack, and left their boss, Antonio Castellano, hanging from the Dearborn Street Bridge as a message written in viscera. But vengeance couldn't heal severed nerves. Money couldn't either. He flew in specialists from Johns Hopkins, Mayo Clinic, and a revolutionary neurological center in Zurich. They examined Joanne and Joyce with expensive equipment and careful hands, then delivered identical verdicts: the damage was irreversible. The girls would need wheelchairs for life. Learn to accept what cannot be changed, Mr. Vitali, a doctor from Massachusetts General told him, sympathy and finality in equal measure. Marco Vitali had built an empire by refusing to accept anyone's limitations. But his fists couldn't beat spinal cord injuries. His guns couldn't shoot away paralysis. For the first time in his brutal life, he faced an enemy he couldn't destroy. The first 3 maids he hired all quit within weeks. They couldn't bear watching 2 beautiful girls trapped in wheelchairs, asking when they could run again, when they could dance, when their legs would work like other children's legs. "It breaks my heart," the last one told Marco's mother, Elena, her eyes wet with tears. "Every time they ask, it breaks my heart." Then, on a cold October morning when frost silvered the estate's windows, someone knocked on the service entrance. Someone who would change everything. But Marco didn't know her secret yet, a secret that connected her to his worst enemy, that made her presence in his home either the greatest gift or the most dangerous threat his family had ever faced. A secret that would force him to choose between the vengeance that defined him and the miracle that could save his daughters. But first, we need to understand how Catherine came to be standing at that door. And why her hands, the same hands now guiding Joanne and Joyce toward the impossible, carried blood that Marco had already spilled. Rain hammered the Vitali estate like bullets against stone, turning the October morning into a gray wash of water and wind. Tony Marcelli, head of security for the past 12 years, stood at the service entrance watching the storm transform the manicured grounds into a waterlogged battlefield. The knock came soft but insistent. 3 measured raps that somehow cut through the downpour. Tony opened the door to find a woman standing in the deluge, mid-20s, soaked to the bone, dark hair plastered to her skull. She carried a single duffel bag that dripped onto the pristine marble steps. No umbrella. No coat adequate for the weather. Just determination wrapped in cheap clothes and calloused hands. "We're not hiring," Tony began, already moving to close the door. "Yes, you are." Her voice stopped him. Not loud, not demanding, but carrying a certainty that made his hand freeze on the doorknob. Catherine's green eyes met his without flinching. "Your last 3 hires quit because they couldn't handle seeing those beautiful girls in wheelchairs. But I can help them." Tony's jaw tightened. The boss's daughters were classified information, protected by the same code of silence that governed every aspect of Vitali operations. "Who the hell told you about?" "No one told me anything. I watch. I listen. I pay attention to the things people try to hide." She shifted the bag to her other shoulder, water streaming from its canvas surface. "Are you going to let me in, or are we going to stand here while I explain how I can give those children their legs back?" Every instinct Tony had developed surviving 2 decades in Chicago's underworld screamed that this woman was either delusional or dangerous. But something in those eyes, something familiar and haunted, made him step aside. "Wait here," he growled, then broke 12 years of protocol by leaving a stranger unattended to find Marco. 5 minutes later, Catherine sat in Marco Vitali's study, creating a puddle on leather that cost more than most people's cars. She didn't apologize for the water. Didn't fidget or look away when Marco entered, his presence filling the room like smoke. He studied her from behind his mahogany desk, this bedraggled woman who'd appeared from nowhere, who somehow knew about his daughters. Plain clothes from a discount store. Hands rough with work, nails cut practical and short. But those eyes. Survivor's eyes. The kind that had seen the bottom of hell and climbed back. "You have 2 minutes to explain why I shouldn't have Tony throw you off my property," Marco said, his Portuguese accent sharpening each word into a blade. "Starting with how you know about my daughters. Public records from the hospital. Police reports you couldn't completely bury. 3 maids hired through the same agency, all quitting within weeks. Catherine's voice remained steady, meeting his threat with facts. I put the pieces together because I needed to. Because I have something your money can't buy. And what's that? Experience with the impossible. Marco leaned back, his expression carved from ice. You think you can do what million-dollar specialists couldn't? The mockery in his tone could have drawn blood. What Harvard-trained neurologist said was permanent. I know I can try what they refuse to, Catherine replied, her gaze never wavering. Specialists see cases, Mr. Vitali. Medical files and statistics and liability concerns. I see children. 2 little girls who deserve to run and dance and live without everyone telling them never. Silence stretched between them, taut as wire. Rain lashed the windows. Somewhere in the house, a clock chimed the hour. Why? Marco finally asked. Why walk into a stranger's home and make impossible promises? Because someone made me the same impossible promise once. And I'm alive and walking because they refused to accept never. Catherine's hands remained folded in her lap, steady despite the water still dripping from her clothes. Give me 1 month. If I can't show you progress, I'll leave and you'll never hear from me again. Something indefinable shifted in Marco's chest. Maybe it was the way she said walking, with such quiet certainty, as if miracles were simply facts waiting to be proven. Maybe it was desperation dressed as intuition. Maybe it was fate, though Marco Vitali had never believed in anything he couldn't control. Tony will show you to the staff quarters. You start Monday. The words left his mouth before his brain fully authorized them. But understand this, Menina, if you hurt my daughters, if you give them false hope and break their hearts, there's no hole deep enough to hide in. Entend? Catherine stood, water still pooling at her feet. I understand, Mr. Vitali. And I promise you'll never regret this. After she left, Marco sat alone in his study, wondering if he'd just made the best decision of his life or the most foolish. That night, in a room barely larger than a closet, Catherine unpacked her single bag with methodical precision. 3 changes of clothes. A toiletry kit. Medical textbooks with broken spines and highlighted passages. And at the bottom, wrapped in a plastic bag to protect it from the rain, a photograph. She pulled it out, her hands finally trembling. Michael Castellano stared back at her, 24 years old in the picture, his arm around her shoulders at her college graduation. Before he'd fallen in with Antonio's crew. Before he'd made choices that would cost innocent children their ability to walk. Before Marco Vitali put 3 bullets in his chest and left him in an alley behind a condemned warehouse. Catherine traced her brother's face, the guilt she carried like stones in her chest threatening to drag her under. Michael had been the driver. He'd brought the shooters to the birthday party. He'd known there would be children there and driven anyway, loyalty to the Castellano family overriding every decent thing their mother had tried to teach them. When Marco's retribution came, Catherine had been estranged from Michael for 2 years. But blood was blood, and when the police called to identify his body, she'd vomited in the precinct bathroom for 20 minutes. She couldn't bring Michael back. Couldn't undo his sins or wash the blood from his hands. But she could undo the damage his choices had caused. She could give Marco Vitali's daughters what her brother had stolen, their future. For 3 months, she'd researched obsessively. Learned everything about Joanne and Joyce Vitale, their condition, their prognosis, their father's desperate search for answers. She'd studied neuroplasticity, unconventional therapies, Eastern healing techniques, anything the medical establishment dismissed as unproven or impossible. And when she was ready, when she'd absorbed every technique that had saved her own paralyzed body years ago, she'd walked through these gates like penance seeking redemption. Catherine placed the photograph face down in her drawer and closed it. Tomorrow, she would meet the children her bloodline had destroyed. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. Monday morning arrived wrapped in pale autumn sunlight. Catherine stood outside the twins' bedroom, her heart hammering against her ribs. She'd rehearsed this moment 100 times, but now that it was here, doubt clawed at her throat. What if she failed? What if the techniques that saved her couldn't save them? What if she was just another person about to break their hearts? She knocked softly and entered. Joanne and Joyce sat in matching wheelchairs positioned in front of a television, cartoons playing to an audience that barely watched. They were smaller than Catherine expected, delicate features, dark curls, their father's intense eyes dulled by months of disappointment. Empty eyes that had learned not to hope. "Hello, princesses," Catherine said softly, moving into their line of sight. Joyce looked up first, her expression hardening with a suspicion no 6-year-old should possess. "You're going to leave too." "Everyone leaves." The words hit Catherine like fists. She lowered herself to her knees, bringing herself to their eye level, letting them see her clearly. "Not me," she said, her voice gentle but certain. "I'm here to teach you something very important." "What?" Joanne asked, curiosity briefly sparking through the emptiness. Catherine smiled, reaching out to gently touch each girl's knee, a touch they couldn't feel, but would. Someday, they would. That your legs remember how to dance. They just forgot for a little while. And we're going to help them remember. "The doctors said we can't," Joyce began. "Doctors are very smart about a lot of things," Catherine interrupted. "But sometimes they're wrong about what's possible. Sometimes miracles just take longer than we expect." In the doorway, unseen by the girls, Marco Vitale stood watching. He'd come to check on the new hire, to ensure she wasn't another disappointment waiting to happen. But something about the scene before him, this stranger kneeling before his daughters, speaking to them with such quiet conviction, her hands gentle on legs that couldn't feel her touch, made something fragile and dangerous stir in his chest. Something he'd buried 18 months ago, wrapped in rage and grief and locked away where it couldn't hurt him. Hope. That night, after Catherine finished her first day and the twins were asleep, she sat in her small room staring at Michael's photograph again. What she hadn't told Joanne and Joyce was that she'd been paralyzed too, once. 7 years old, a drunk driver, for years in a wheelchair while doctors said never and her mother said watch me prove them wrong. What she hadn't told Marco was that her miracle came at a price she was still paying, the knowledge that healing took more than techniques and exercises. It took faith so desperate and absolute that it bordered on delusion. And what she couldn't tell anyone was that redemption might not be possible. That some sins were too dark to wash clean, some damage too profound to undo. But she would try anyway. Because guilt demanded penance, and penance demanded sacrifice, and sometimes the only way to honor the dead was to save the living they destroyed. Some truths, Catherine knew, had to wait. But miracles? Miracles couldn't afford to. Week 1 of Catherine's employment brought whispers that spread through the Vitali estate like smoke through ventilation shafts. The household staff gathered in the kitchen during their afternoon break, voices low but urgent. Maria Gonzalez, the cook who'd worked for the family since before the twins were born, set down her coffee with a sharp click. "She's singing to them," Maria reported, her tone caught between disbelief and dismissal. "Just singing and massaging their legs with warm oils. That's not therapy, that's nonsense. My cousin's daughter had physical therapy after her car accident, and it was nothing like whatever that is." Through the kitchen window, they could see into the garden where Catherine knelt beside Joyce's wheelchair, her hands working oil into the child's motionless legs while her voice carried a melody none of them recognized. Old and haunting, like something their grandmothers might have sung. Elena Vitali stood at a different window, rosary beads clicking through her fingers like a metronome counting down to disappointment. At 63, Marco's mother had survived her husband's brutality, buried him without tears, and raised a son in the violent machinery of Chicago's underworld. She knew predators when she saw them. "She's a charlatan," Elena murmured to Tony, who stood nearby with his usual vigilance. "Preying on our desperation. On Marco's desperation." Tony said nothing, but his jaw tightened. He'd seen the boss desperate before, desperate enough to paint city blocks red, desperate enough to burn empires. But never desperate enough to trust a stranger who appeared from nowhere with impossible promises. "Give her time, Signora," Tony finally offered, though his own doubt tasted bitter. "Time." Elena's laugh held no humor. "Time for her to break those babies' hearts again? No. Better to cut losses before hope becomes another wound." But Catherine continued her work, unbothered by the skepticism radiating from every corner of the estate like radiation from a dying star. Every morning at 9 o'clock, she wheeled Joanne and Joyce to the garden where autumn was surrendering to winter's approach. The exercises she performed looked nothing like the clinical physical therapy Marco had witnessed in hospital rehabilitation centers. Catherine would lift the girls from their wheelchairs and cradle them upright, swaying to music only she could hear. She'd massage their legs with oils that smelled of lavender and rosemary, her hands moving in patterns that seemed more ritual than medical. And she'd tell them stories, not fairy tales about princesses waiting for rescue, but warrior tales about women who carved their own salvation from impossible circumstances. "There was once a queen who lost the use of her legs in battle," Catherine narrated, her hands never stopping their work on Joanne's calves. "The court physicians said she'd never walk again. But the queen said, 'Then I'll crawl until my legs remember they were made for running.' And every day, she trained. Every single day, even when everyone told her to accept defeat." "Did she walk again?" Joyce asked, leaning forward in her wheelchair. "She did more than walk. She danced at her daughter's wedding and led her army into battle one final time." Catherine's smile carried secrets. Because she understood something the physicians didn't. "What?" both girls asked in unison. "That the body remembers what the mind forgets." When Marco questioned her methods that afternoon, catching her in the hallway, his tone edged with the dangerous patience of a man whose tolerance was wearing thin, Catherine met his skepticism without flinching. "What exactly are you doing with my daughters?" he demanded. Because it looks like storytelling and massage, not physical therapy. I'm reminding them that their legs were made for dancing, Mr. Vitali. The specialists treated their paralysis as a locked door. I'm teaching them that doors can be unlocked if you remember where you hid the key. That's poetry, not medicine. Sometimes, Catherine replied, her green eyes steady on his, poetry accomplishes what medicine cannot. The visualization exercises began in week 2. Catherine would have Joanne and Joyce close their eyes, their small faces scrunched in concentration as she guided them through imagination exercises that seemed absurd to anyone watching. Describe the color green, Catherine instructed one morning. Not the green you see with your eyes. The green you feel beneath your feet when you run through grass. I don't remember, Joyce whispered, tears forming at the corners of her eyes. It's been so long, Catherine. I don't remember what running feels like. Catherine knelt beside her wheelchair, taking the child's hands in her own. Yes, you do, baby girl. Close your eyes. Deeper. Running feels like flying with your feet still touching the ground. It feels like your heart might burst from your chest because you're moving so fast. It feels like freedom. Joyce's breathing changed, deepened. Her closed eyes moved beneath their lids as if watching something beautiful and distant. I see it, she whispered. I'm running in the garden. The grass it tickles. That's it. That's the feeling. Your legs remember, Joyce. They're just waiting for you to remind them. From his office window 3 floors above, Marco Vitali stood watching the scene unfold. And for the first time since bullets shattered his daughter's spines, he saw something on their faces that made his chest constrict painfully. They were smiling. Genuinely, radiantly smiling. Catherine lifted Joyce from her wheelchair, holding the child upright against her body, and began to sway. There was no music playing, but Catherine hummed something low and rhythmic, and Joyce rested her head against the woman's shoulder, still smiling. Marco's hand pressed flat against the cold window glass, his reflection ghostly in the afternoon light. Hope, he thought. That's what's stirring in my chest. That dangerous, fragile, utterly foolish thing called hope. That evening, Elena confronted her son in his study where he sat reviewing quarterly reports from his legitimate import business, the kind that existed primarily to explain where money actually came from. She's filling their heads with false hope, Elena said without preamble, closing the door behind her. When she fails, and she will fail, Marco, it will break them all over again. Is that what you want? To watch your daughter's hearts shatter twice? Marco swirled the whiskey in his glass, the amber liquid catching lamplight. He'd built an empire on certainty, on reading people's intentions in the micro-expressions they couldn't control, on knowing when someone was lying or scheming or afraid. But Catherine? She was a closed book written in a language he didn't speak. 1 month, he finally said, his voice carrying the finality of a judge's gavel. If there's no measurable progress, she's gone. 1 month is too long to. May, he interrupted, using the Portuguese that signaled the conversation was ending. 1 month. I've decided. Elena studied her son's face, seeing the same stubborn hope she'd seen in him as a boy, before his father beat it out of him, before Chicago's streets hardened him into the man who now controlled half the city's underworld. She left without another word, her rosary beads clicking like tiny bones. 3 weeks into Catherine's employment, during an evening massage session while Joanne watched cartoons, it happened. Catherine's hands worked warm oil into Joyce's left calf, her voice humming that strange old melody. When she felt it, the barest flicker of movement. Joyce's left toe twitched. Just once, barely perceptible, like a bird's heartbeat against cupped palms. Catherine's hands stilled. Her breath caught. Every nerve in her body screamed to react, to call for Marco, to celebrate this impossible first sign. But she forced herself to remain calm. She simply continued humming, working the muscles, waiting to see if the movement would repeat. It didn't. Not that evening. But Catherine had felt it. The beginning of the miracle she'd promised. That night at midnight, when the estate had settled into its restless sleep, Catherine knocked on Marco's office door. He looked up from ledgers that detailed shipments that had nothing to do with the wine bottles listed on invoices. His expression shifted from annoyance at the interruption to sharp attention when he saw who stood in his doorway. "It's late, Miss Castellano." Catherine stepped inside, uninvited. "Joyce's neural pathways are trying to reconnect, Mr. Vitali. The doctors were wrong." Marco set down his pen with deliberate slowness, the kind of controlled movement that preceded violence. "Doctors don't make mistakes like that. Not specialists from Johns Hopkins and Mayo Clinic. They do when they stop believing in possibilities." Catherine's gaze didn't waver despite the danger radiating from the man behind the desk. "Your daughters can heal. But you have to believe it too. They feel your despair, Mr. Vitali. It's in every room of this house like poison in the air. And it's keeping them trapped." The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. "You presume," Marco said, his voice quiet in the way that made grown men confess to things they'd never done, "to lecture me about my daughters. I presume to care about them more than your pride." Catherine's voice remained steady, though her heart hammered against her ribs. "I'm telling you I saw movement today. Microscopic, barely there, but real. And I'm telling you that if you don't start believing they can heal, your doubt will sabotage everything we're building." Marco stood, 6 feet of coiled violence and wounded father wrapped in expensive Italian tailoring. "Get out of my office." Catherine turned to leave, her hand on the doorknob, then paused. "They asked me today why you don't smile anymore, Mr. Vitali." Marco froze. "I couldn't answer that," Catherine continued softly. "Because I don't know if you've forgotten how, or if you're too afraid to try. But they notice. They see their father drowning in grief, and they think it's their fault. That they're the reason you stopped being happy." The door closed softly behind her, leaving Marco alone in his office, surrounded by ledgers and lies and a question that cut deeper than any blade ever could. When had he stopped smiling? When had he let rage consume every other emotion until there was nothing left but ash and vengeance? Marco sat back down, but he didn't return to his ledgers. He simply stared at the closed door, wondering if the stranger who'd walked into his life carried salvation or damnation. Or perhaps, most terrifyingly, both. 6 weeks after Catherine's arrival, the Vitali estate had settled into an uneasy rhythm. The household staff still whispered, but softer now, their skepticism eroding like shoreline against persistent waves. Elena still prayed her rosaries, but with less desperation, her supplications shifting from pleas to gratitude. And Marco still watched from his office window, but with something fragile and dangerous creeping into his guarded heart. Something that might be hope. During a massage session on a cold November afternoon, it happened again. Catherine's hands worked warm oil into Joyce's left calf when the child's toe twitched, stronger this time, unmistakable. "Joyce! Your toe moved!" Joanne shrieked from her wheelchair, pointing with wild excitement. Joyce looked down at her own foot, her 6-year-old face fierce with concentration. The toe twitched again. Then again, like a heartbeat finding its rhythm. Catherine's voice remained calm, though her heart hammered against her ribs. "Good, baby girl. Remember that feeling. Tell your leg you remember." Joyce's eyes squeezed shut, her whole body trembling with effort. "I remember," she whispered. "I remember." Over the next week, small movements multiplied like spring flowers breaking through frozen ground. Joyce's ankle flexed during a story about warrior queens. Joanne's knee bent during a visualization exercise, just a degree or two, but undeniable. Toes wiggled. Muscles responded to commands they'd ignored for 18 months. Catherine documented everything in a leather journal she kept hidden under her mattress: dates, times, which movements, how long they lasted. She knew what was coming. Marco would want proof, would demand specialists, would question everything with the paranoid scrutiny of a man who'd survived Chicago's underworld by trusting nothing. He brought in Dr. Sarah Wilson from Northwestern Memorial on a gray Tuesday morning. Dr. Wilson had examined Joanne and Joyce after the attack, had delivered the devastating prognosis with clinical compassion. Now she returned, her skepticism evident in every precise movement as she ran tests, checked reflexes, reviewed new scans. Her professional composure cracked like ice under pressure. "Mr. Vitale, I don't." She paused, removed her glasses, cleaned them unnecessarily. "This shouldn't be possible. The nerve damage was catastrophic. Complete severance at L3, L4 for Joyce, massive trauma for Joanne. But there's definitely neural activity where there was none before." She turned to Catherine, who stood quietly in the corner. "Spontaneous nerve regeneration at this scale is virtually unprecedented in medical literature. So they can heal?" Marco's voice carried an edge that could cut. "I'm witnessing something I can't explain," Dr. Wilson admitted. She looked at Catherine again. "Whatever you're doing, please don't stop. Medical science can't explain it, but I'm watching it happen." That night at 2 a.m., Elena found Catherine in the kitchen, preparing warm oil for tomorrow's session. The older woman stood in the doorway, her rosary beads silent for once. "You really believe they can walk?" Catherine met her eyes without hesitation. "I know they can. Because I did." Elena's breath caught. "You were paralyzed?" "From age 7 to 11. Car accident. The doctors told my mother I'd never walk. She decided they were wrong." Catherine's voice softened with memory. "Every day for 4 years, the same exercises, the same belief. And one day, I stood up." Elena crossed herself, tears streaming down her weathered face. "An angel. God sent us an angel." "Not an angel," Catherine said quietly. "Just someone who remembers what it's like to be told never." The older woman pulled Catherine into an embrace, whispering prayers of gratitude in Italian. But Catherine's past was closer than anyone knew. After Elena left, Catherine checked her phone and found a text from an unknown number, sent at 1:47 a.m. "I know who you are. I know what your brother did. Does Vitaly?" Her hand trembled as she read it again, then deleted it. But deletion didn't erase the threat. Someone knew her secret. Someone was watching. Someone had connected Catherine to Michael Castellano, to the attack that shattered this family. She sat in the dark kitchen, the warm oil forgotten, calculating how long she had before everything unraveled. The next morning, Tony Marcelli approached Marco in his study, carrying a manila folder with the thickness of bad news. "Boss, you said to run background checks on all new staff." Tony's jaw was tight. "You need to see this about Catherine." Marco took the folder, opened it. His eyes scanned the first page: birth certificate, employment history, address changes. Then he reached the second page and froze. Birth name: Catherine Maria Castellano. Father: Vincent Castellano, deceased. Brother: Michael Anthony Castellano, deceased, October 2024. The name hit him like a bullet to the chest. Castellano. The family he'd burned to ash. The family whose driver had brought shooters to his daughter's birthday party. Marco's hand crushed the folder's edge, his knuckles white. "She's been here 6 weeks, he said, his voice deadly quiet. "Living in my house. Touching my daughters. Want me to handle it?" Tony asked, hand moving instinctively toward his concealed weapon. Marco stared at the name, Castellano, and thought of Joyce's toe moving, Joanne's knee bending, Dr. Wilson's astonished face saying unprecedented. "No," he said finally. "Not yet. I handle this myself." Marco's office at 2 a.m. felt like a tomb waiting for a body. Catherine stood before his desk, summoned without explanation, wearing the same clothes she'd fallen asleep in. A gun rested on the polished mahogany between them, not pointed at her, but present. Deliberate. She saw the weapon and understood immediately. "Your last name is Castellano." Not a question. A statement loaded with lethal intent, delivered in the flat tone Marco used before violence. Catherine met his gaze without flinching. "It was. I changed it legally 3 years ago." "Michael Castellano was your brother?" "Yes." The silence that followed held its breath. Outside, snow began falling over Chicago, transforming the city into something clean and white and false. Inside, 2 people who'd killed and suffered, one with guns, one with guilt, stared across an oak desk that might as well have been a chasm. Marco's hand rested near the gun. His daughters slept 2 floors above, their legs growing stronger every day because of this woman. This Castellano. "You came into my home knowing what your family did." "I came because of what my family did." Catherine's voice remained steady, though her heart hammered against her ribs hard enough to crack bone. "Michael was my brother, but we were estranged for years. I hated what he became, who he worked for. When I learned he was the driver that day, when I learned what happened to Joanne and Joyce." She paused, swallowed hard against the stones lodged in her throat. "I can't resurrect the dead, Mr. Vitaly. I can't undo the past. But I can give your daughters their future. That's the only restitution I can offer. Marco stood slowly, the chair scraping back with a sound like a blade being drawn. You used my daughters to ease your conscience. I used my guilt to save your daughters. There's a difference. Get out of my house. Catherine didn't move. Will you continue their therapy? Get out. Their progress will stop without consistency. You've seen what happens when. Marco's fist slammed the desk, rattling the gun, rattling the walls, rattling the fragile hope that had been building for 6 weeks. I said get out. Catherine packed her single bag in the pre-dawn darkness, her hands moving with mechanical precision. She didn't allow herself to cry. Didn't allow herself to feel anything except the weight of sins, hers, Michael's, the Castellano family's, pressing down like a burial shroud. She didn't say goodbye to Joanne and Joyce. Looking at their sleeping faces would shatter what remained of her heart. On her way out, she passed Elena in the hallway. The older woman stood in her nightgown and robe, rosary beads clutched in weathered hands. You're leaving. Elena's voice cracked. I have to. Those girls need you. Catherine's smile was broken glass. Their father needs to hate someone more than he needs to see them walk. I understand. I'd hate me too. For 3 days, Marco tried to continue the therapy himself. He performed the exercises mechanically, his hands where Catherine's had been, but without her certainty. He told the warrior stories, but without her belief. He massaged their legs with warm oil, but without her faith that broken things could mend. The progress stopped. Joyce's ankle went still. Joanne's knee stopped bending. And every night, both girls cried for Catherine until exhaustion claimed them. On the 4th day, Elena confronted her son in his study. The slap echoed through the estate like a gunshot. You fool. You're letting pride destroy your daughter's only hope. Marco's jaw clenched, red blooming on his cheek. She's a Castellano. She's the woman who gave your babies their legs back. Elena's voice trembled with fury that had been building for days. Her brother's sins are not hers. Or are you going to punish innocent children for their father's crimes too? The words hit Marco like bullets finding flesh. He thought of his own father, Dante Vitali, a monster who'd beaten him for showing weakness, who'd built an empire on suffering and taught his son that mercy was for the weak. Marco had spent his entire life proving he wasn't his father, that he could be strong without being cruel, powerful without being sadistic. But here he stood, punishing a woman for her brother's crimes. Punishing his daughters for his pride. Was he any different? Or had he spent 40 years running from his father's shadow, only to become exactly what he feared? The question cut deeper than any blade ever could. Marco drove through Chicago's worst neighborhoods, his Mercedes out of place among abandoned storefronts and burned-out buildings. Tony had called with Catherine's location, a shelter in Englewood, one of the city's most dangerous areas, where even Marco's enforcers traveled in pairs. He went alone. Inside the shelter, fluorescent lights flickered over cracked linoleum. The place smelled of disinfectant and desperation. Marco found her in a back room, kneeling beside a young boy in a wheelchair, performing the same exercises she'd used on his daughters. No pay. No recognition. Just patient dedication to children whose families couldn't afford million-dollar specialists. He stood in the doorway, unseen, watching her guide the boy through visualization techniques. That's it, Tommy. Remember what running feels like. Your legs remember too. The boy's foot flexed, barely, but unmistakably. Catherine's smile bloomed across her face, genuine and radiant, making something in Marco's chest tighten painfully. The girls are asking for you. Catherine turned, saw him, and for the first time since he'd known her, she looked afraid. Not of violence, she'd faced his gun without flinching. This was something deeper. Fear of hope being offered again, only to be snatched away. I understand why you had to send me away. I was wrong. The words cost Marco everything. Pride, certainty, the armor he'd worn his entire life like a second skin. They need you. I need you to finish what you started. What changed? My mother asked me if I punish innocent children for their father's crimes. Made me think about my own father, what he did to me, who I became because of it. Marco's voice roughened with emotion he usually strangled. You're not your brother, Catherine. You proved that every day you helped my daughters. Catherine's eyes searched his face. And if I fail? If the progress stops, if they never walk, will you blame me then? Blame my bloodline. I'll blame the same doctors who gave up. The same fate that put bullets in my daughters' spines. But not you. Never you again. Catherine studied him for a long moment, searching for deception and finding only raw honesty bleeding through the cracks in his control. I need to tell you something. About why I could help them. Marco waited, tension coiling in his shoulders. I was paralyzed too. Age 7 to 11. Car accident. My mother was a single parent, working 3 jobs, couldn't afford experimental treatments. So she became my therapist herself. For years, every single day, never accepting what doctors said was permanent. Marco's eyes widened. You walked. I walked. I ran. I danced at my high school prom. Catherine's eyes shone with tears that refused to fall. When I learned what Michael did to your daughters, I saw a chance to honor my mother's memory. She died believing in the impossible. I wanted to do the same. The silence between them held something fragile and precious, understanding between 2 people who'd both lost everything and found purpose in the wreckage. That evening, Catherine walked back through the Vitali gates as sunset painted the estate gold and crimson. Joanne and Joyce were playing in the sitting room. Marco had wheeled them there, trying to maintain some normalcy while their world crumbled. When they saw Catherine through the window, their screams of joy shattered the quiet. Catherine! They tried to wheel themselves toward the door, colliding with furniture in their desperation. Catherine ran to them, falling to her knees as they crashed into her arms, sobbing and laughing and clinging to her like she was oxygen itself. You came back, Joyce cried into her shoulder. You came back. I promised I wouldn't leave you, didn't I? Catherine whispered, holding them both, tears streaming down her face. I'm sorry I broke that promise. I'm so sorry. Marco stood in the doorway, watching the reunion, his throat tight. Elena appeared beside him, touching his arm gently. You did the right thing, mio figlio. Later that evening, after the girls had exhausted themselves with joy and fallen asleep, Catherine knelt beside their beds. She brushed hair from their foreheads and whispered a promise that Marco heard from the hallway. "We have work to do, princesses. Because in exactly 1 month, you're going to walk to your father. And this time, nothing will stop us." 4 weeks of intensive therapy began the morning after Catherine's return. She worked the girls 14 hours a day, pushing them to limits that made Marco pace his office like a caged animal. "Is this safe?" he asked one afternoon, watching Joanne struggle to stand with parallel bars, her small face contorted with effort and pain. "Pain is part of healing," Catherine replied, her hand steadying the child's trembling legs. "They're stronger than you think." Week 1, both girls stood unsupported for 10 seconds. Marco timed it on his watch, holding his breath, counting each second like a prayer. Week 2, Joanne took her first assisted step, Catherine's hands gripping her waist. The child's leg dragged, her foot barely clearing the floor, but it moved forward. Joyce followed 3 days later, tears streaming down her face as she commanded her body to remember. Week 3, they walked holding Catherine's hands for 20 feet across the garden, their legs shaking violently, their determination absolute. Week 4, the real test began. Catherine announced her intention at breakfast, her voice calm and final. "This Saturday, in the garden, the girls are going to walk to their father. 30 feet. Alone." The household erupted in protest. Elena crossed herself repeatedly, rosary beads clicking like frantic heartbeats. Tony suggested waiting, being cautious, giving them more time. Even the girls looked terrified. "We're not ready," Joyce whispered, her eyes wide. Catherine knelt before them, taking their small hands in hers. "Remember the princess warriors I told you about? They didn't wait until they felt ready. They became ready by doing the impossible thing." That night, Marco found Catherine in the garden, setting up the path with small flags marking the distance. "What if they fall? Then they get back up. That's what warriors do. What if they can't? What if we're pushing too hard, too fast?" His voice carried the weight of a father's fear, the kind that killed men for lesser threats but stood helpless before his daughter's fragility. Catherine faced him, moonlight catching in her eyes. "What if they can, and the only thing holding them back is our fear? Your daughters have spent 18 months in wheelchairs, Mr. Vitali. They deserve to run free, even if it means risking failure." The night before, Catherine sat with the girls at bedtime, their small hands clutching hers like lifelines. "Are you scared?" Joanne asked. Terrified, Catherine admitted honestly. "Really?" "Of course. Because I love you both so much, and I want this for you more than I've wanted anything in my life. But fear means we're about to do something brave." Joyce squeezed her hand. "Will you be there? Every step of the way. Until you don't need me anymore." Saturday morning arrived wrapped in brilliant sunshine that felt like either blessing or mockery. The garden was set. Household staff lined the path, maids, gardeners, security officers, everyone who'd witnessed this 18-month journey from tragedy to this impossible moment. Elena knelt in the grass, praying with desperate intensity. Tony stood ready to intervene, his body coiled with protective instinct. Marco waited at the far end, 30 feet from where his daughters sat in their wheelchairs, his hands clenched at his sides. Catherine wheeled Joanne and Joyce to the starting point, then stepped back. "Okay, princesses. This is your moment. Stand up." The girls grasped each other's hands and rose. Their legs shook violently, muscles screaming after months of disuse, but they stood. Actually stood. "Now let go of each other. Catherine." Joanne's voice cracked with terror. "I can't. Trust yourself as much as I trust you." They released hands, standing alone. Marco's breath caught in his throat. Elena's rosary beads clicked faster, her prayers becoming desperate whispers. Tony shifted forward, ready to catch them. And in the morning sun, 2 6-year-old girls who were told they'd never walk again stood on their own legs, preparing to prove that impossible was just another word for not yet. Complete silence descended on the garden. Even the birds seemed to hold their breath, as if nature itself understood the weight of this moment. Joanne and Joyce stood alone, 30 feet from their father. Between them lay a distance that might as well be the Grand Canyon, an impossible journey measured not in feet but in faith. "We can do this," Joanne whispered to her sister. "Together," Joyce agreed. Joanne lifted her right foot. It trembled violently, hovering in the air like a leaf in wind, her entire body shaking with effort. Then, contact. Her foot touched grass. 1 step. Joyce followed, her left foot dragging slightly, scraping against the lawn, but moving. Actually moving. 2 steps. Marco's hands clenched at his sides, his knuckles white. Elena's prayers became audible, desperate Italian flowing from her lips. Tony shifted forward, every muscle coiled to intervene. But Catherine remained still, hands folded, faith absolute. At 15 feet, Joyce's ankle buckled. She pitched forward, her fragile balance shattered. Joanne grabbed her sister instinctively, and they both teetered dangerously, locked in an embrace that might save them or bring them both down. The crowd gasped. Marco surged forward. "No." Catherine's voice cut through the panic. "Let them figure it out." The twins clung to each other, wobbling like sailors on storm-tossed decks, their 6-year-old faces showing fierce concentration that mirrored their father's own ruthless determination. Joyce planted her foot, grinding it into the grass for purchase. Joanne adjusted her grip on her sister's arm, redistributing their weight. They steadied. Wobbled. Held. They didn't fall. Step by agonizing step, they crossed the garden. Their legs shook so violently it seemed impossible they could bear weight. Tears streamed down their faces, from effort, from fear, from joy so pure and overwhelming it hurt to witness. 20 feet. 25 feet. Marco dropped to his knees, arms open wide, his face wet with tears he hadn't shed since the day they were born. His voice broke on their names. "Come on, babies. Come to Papa." 5 feet left. 4. 3. The girls' strength was fading fast. Their legs threatened to give out completely, muscles screaming after the longest journey of their lives. "You can do this," Catherine called softly. 5 more steps. Just 5. Joanne and Joyce looked at each other, some twin communication passing between them that no one else could hear. Then they moved together, synchronized, determined, drawing strength from the same mysterious bond that had connected them since before birth. 2 feet. 1 foot. They crashed into Marco's arms. The garden erupted. Applause thundered from every direction. Maids wept openly, mascara streaming down their faces. Tony wiped his eyes roughly with the back of his hand, his jaw clenched against emotion. Elena fell to her knees, thanking God in rapid Italian, her rosary beads pressed to her lips. But Marco only held his daughters, feeling their legs supporting their weight, their hearts beating against his chest, alive and whole and walking. He buried his face in their hair, his shoulders shaking with sobs that came from somewhere deeper than grief, somewhere beyond joy. "We did it, Papa," Joanne sobbed into his shoulder. "You did it," he whispered back, his voice breaking. "My brave, beautiful girls. You did it. Are you proud of us?" Joyce asked, pulling back to see his face. "Proud?" Marco's laugh was half sob. "I've never been more proud of anything in my entire life." Catherine stood apart from the celebration, watching the family reunion with quiet satisfaction. Her purpose was fulfilled. This is what redemption looked like, not grand gestures or dramatic confessions, but 2 children walking when every expert said they shouldn't be able to. Elena approached, tears still streaming, and pulled Catherine into a fierce embrace. "Thank you. Thank you for giving me back my granddaughters." "They gave themselves back," Catherine whispered. "I just showed them the way." Marco looked up from where he knelt with his daughters in his arms. His eyes found Catherine's across the garden, and he mouthed 2 words that carried the weight of miracles. "Thank you." That evening, as the household celebrated with champagne and laughter echoing through rooms that had known only grief for 18 months, Catherine slipped away to the garden. She sat on the bench where she'd first told Joanne and Joyce about warrior princesses, where she'd promised them their legs would remember how to dance. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, and for the first time since Michael's death, Catherine allowed herself to believe something she'd thought impossible. That some sins could be forgiven. That redemption wasn't just a fantasy told to ease guilty consciences. That broken things could be made whole again. But she didn't yet know that Marco had one final surprise, one that would change her life as profoundly as she had changed his daughters. 6 months later, Lincoln Park stretched before them in autumn glory. Leaves crunched under small feet as Joanne and Joyce raced ahead, their laughter carried on the wind, legs strong and sure. No wheelchairs. No assistants. Just 2 chattering 7-year-old girls pointing at ducks and demanding ice cream with the entitled confidence of children who'd never been told they couldn't. Marco walked beside Catherine, watching his daughters with wonder that hadn't faded despite half a year of miracles becoming mundane. "You changed everything," he said quietly. "They changed themselves," Catherine corrected. "I just reminded them they could." The medical community documented Joanne and Joyce's recovery as one of the most remarkable cases of neurological healing in modern history. Specialists who dismissed Catherine's methods now studied them, publishing papers with titles like "Unconventional Approaches to Pediatric Paralysis" and requesting her consultation. She'd worked with 12 other, hopeless, cases. 3 showed significant improvement. Northwestern Memorial offered her a position leading a new pediatric neuroplasticity program with a 6-figure salary and her own research team. She declined. Why? Marco had asked, genuinely confused. Because I'm not finished here yet. In 6 months, Marco Vitali had transformed beyond recognition. He was divesting from criminal operations, transitioning to legitimate businesses with the same ruthless efficiency he'd once applied to territorial expansion. He'd established the Vitali Family Therapeutic Foundation, funding disability research and therapy for families who couldn't afford specialists. Some in his organization called it going soft. Marco called it choosing a legacy his daughters could be proud of. You know what the old Marco would have done, he told Catherine one evening as they watched the girls play. What? Killed anyone who suggested he go legitimate. But after watching you heal my daughters with nothing but patience and faith, I realized real power isn't in taking life. It's in giving it back. Catherine was no longer just the maid. Marco had given her a suite in the main house, a salary that made her gasp, and the title of director of the Vitali Family Therapeutic Foundation. But more importantly, she'd become family. Elena treated her like a daughter. The girls called her Aunt Catherine. And Marco. Marco looked at her with something neither of them had named yet, but both felt growing in the spaces between words. At the girls' 7th birthday party, exactly 3 years after the attack that changed everything, Catherine stood in the garden watching them play tag, running and jumping and shrieking with joy that felt like music. Elena approached, linking arms with her. You saved more than their legs, you know. What do you mean? You saved this family. Marco was becoming his father, all rage and violence and empty victories. You reminded him what matters. Catherine watched Marco chase his daughters, his laughter genuine and free, nothing like the cold man who'd held a gun on his desk while interrogating her. They saved themselves, she insisted. No, child. You saved each other. That evening, as the party wound down and guests departed, Marco found Catherine in the garden where the girls had first walked. The place where impossible became possible. I've been thinking, he began. Dangerous habit. He smiled, the real smile she'd taught him to wear again. I want to ask you something. Not as your employer. As someone who cares about you. Catherine's breath caught. Would you consider staying? Not in the guest suite. Not as an employee. But as part of this family. Permanently. He pulled out a small velvet box. Catherine opened it with trembling hands. Inside, a simple gold ring with 3 small stones, one for each girl, one for the miracle they'd created together. Is this whatever you want it to be? Marco said, his voice soft. A promise. A beginning. A thank you. Or just a symbol that some people walk into our lives and change us so completely, we can't imagine them ever leaving. Catherine looked at the ring, then at the garden where she'd knelt in penance and risen in redemption, then at this man who'd learned to choose love over vengeance. Yes, she whispered. To all of it. Yes.